Insurance is going to go up, costs are going to go up, people are going to want to use different routes for moving things, and all that starts to put cost pressure, which eventually consumers will feel. You know, my definition of supply chain management is about the management of relationships.
So how we going to get our next generation motivated to join supply chain? So the talent is needed always.
In some countries we have very, very young populations, in others it's aging populations. So it's a challenge whichever way it goes. The multipolar world and geopolitics, multiple centres of power and influence. Well, we're seeing even more of that now. And I think it's really important to remember, it's not a matter of stopping it ever happening. Also recognise it will happen to you. You've got to have the attitude it will happen to you. Right?
If you have to give us one advice, what you would give us?
So one bit of advice. Oh gosh, I think one of the key things, the type of legislation is important, because at the end of the day, when a supply chain manager is under pressure, thinking I need to buy stuff cheaply, and they're not really thinking through what are the consequences of buying this stuff cheaply. Somebody is going to be paying somewhere. So I often say, if we're thinking about free delivery and free returns, it's not free.
It's not free.
Somebody is paying
for it.
Somebody is paying, and
if you are not a professor of supply chain, or if you're not in supply chain field, what you will be doing?
I think I would be.
So you are an angel with a superpower, right? Let's call it Gabriel, for example. And you have to give one superpower to all supply chain people to make their life easier, quicker, efficient, right? What superpower you will give them?
You know what? I think it would be.
So if you have to pick one of the British Prime Minister to be a supply chain manager, who would you pick?
A Prime Minister.
You could go as far as this.
I can go right back in time.
You can pick it.
Oh dear.
This video is brought to you by us, SCMDOJO. We provide awesome courses, guides, best practices for supply chain community.
Hi folks, welcome to one more episode of the Supply Chain Show. As you know, right now in the state of war, cost of shipment is going up. There's a Strait of Hormuz issue, nobody's going through. Supply chain managers, not just in Middle East, globally facing big challenges. It's a high risk situation. And I thought, who can I find to talk about this topic? Who's the expert? There's only one person in the world, the top 10 influencer, Professor Dr. Richard OBE, right? Sir, how are you?
Very well, thank you.
Good.
Very well.
So I'm just going to jump into it, right? And I'm going to just take your high level view where you see this issue right now and just start with the biggest risk, and then we talk about the solution.
Okay, well, just to start off, supply chains being disrupted, this is nothing new. So Mark Twain actually said, he said, history never repeats itself, but it rhymes. It rhymes. So one of the things that we can do is we can look at some of the things that took place even, during the invasion of Ukraine or COVID and so on and so forth. And what we're starting to see is similar things playing out. So when we have major logistical shipping areas cut off, that starts to present challenges for all sorts of things. And I think the thing that we really need to actually understand is what I often call the parallel interactions in this. So it's seemingly unrelated supply chains that become disrupted. So the main focus at the moment, of course, is very much on, oil and gas. But hang on a minute, if we don't have oil and gas, that will have an impact on fertilizer. It's going to have an impact on other things as well. If it's impact on fertilizer, that will then have an impact on food supply chains. So food supply chains will start to be disrupted. What we will then end up with is possible shortages of other commodities as time goes on, which then starts to lead to inflation.
Which we don't see right now. As such.
So we will start to see probably in the next sort of 4 or 5 months, inflation starting to kick in. And we're also going to see that just in physical, the logistical side of things. We're already seeing that, if you're going to start moving things around, insurance is going to go up. Costs are going to go up. People are going to want to use different routes for moving things, and all that starts to put cost pressure, which eventually consumers will feel. But we're going to already have, of course, governments are starting to feel it already.
The energy cost is going up.
I think
you rightly point out, but I want to give you an example, right? And with a life of a supply chain manager right now, because our audience is mostly supply chain folks. So our customer in Saudi, right? They are a $100 million tire distributor. He called me. He said, "You know what? I have the port of Dammam is basically shut. I have to bring everything to Jeddah now because of this insurance cost has gone up. There's extra $3,000 charges for each container. I can't do business without it. What can I do?" I said, "Mate, I've got no idea what you can do." I mean, so people like them who are into this situation right now, what would be your advice? Right? Okay, what? Of course, they have to bear the cost as well, right? But give them some hope, right? How they're gonna get out of this, how the things will improve.
Okay, the challenge that you're in is if you're looking at supply chain risk and resilience, you have to actually start with being ready and preparing. And this is one of the big mistakes that often people make is they don't have the preparation in place. What we then move to is responding. So it's prepare and be ready. Then we respond and then we go into recovery. Now, the challenge that we have, so it's prepare, respond, recover. The challenge that we actually have is that if all of a sudden people have got no preparation in place, this becomes an incredible challenge.
Absolutely.
Because you've got to, you don't have any options. So one of the big concepts which I worked with DHL on last year was something called supply chain diversification. And really what we're talking about there is that, in any situation, you need to think about multi-shoring, not multi-sourcing, but multi-shoring. So what you're going to want is effectively suppliers in different areas of the world. So, at the end of the day, if the Middle East gets shut down, you've got sources you can pull on from other areas of the world.
Correct, yeah.
It's not just about that. It's also about, if you like, multiple routes. So it's also about thinking through, well, okay, if I'm in that particular location, how can I actually route my goods differently? The problem is everybody gets locked into one way of doing it, which is I'm going to put a boat, I'm going to shove it through that channel there.
That's it.
Hang on a minute. What about, can we use land? Can we use rail? Can we use air? Have we actually explored those different options? Now, the cost to serve will be different, but we need to be able to actually understand those different things. So we've got multiple routes and multiple modes. Modes as well. And so you've got effectively these 3 dimensions that you're having to manage. And that's why it's particularly challenging. Because, of course, if you're looking at multi-shoring, right, what that requires is your procurement teams to actually be looking around the world saying, well, can I actually get, can I get that service from South America? I also can get it from Asia. I can also get it from this location there. But often people don't actually go and think through that thing. So that's part of your preparation. It needs to be, do I know where the options are? Do I have the relationships in place? And it doesn't matter, we love to think that we can just automate and computerize supply chains. No, you can't. It's all about, my definition of supply chain management is about the management of relationships. Right, with your customers, your suppliers, everybody, so that you can actually reduce cost for the final customer and create the maximum amount of value for everybody as it goes through the chain. So we have to sort of reflect on that, and that's why this being ready, having the readiness, then being able to respond, and then being able to recover is so important. But the key thing then is we have to go beyond resilience. And this is, if you like, the new thing, which is we're having to start thinking about. And this is where we're starting to actually discuss something called the anti-fragile supply chain.
Okay, anti-fragile.
So this is now getting into quite exciting. So if you think about fragile, fragile is if we have a glass, we drop it, it breaks. Right? If we think about resilient supply chain, it goes back to the state it was in before. So it's a bit like a ball, a squashy ball. We bounce it and nothing really changes. It's just the same as it was. But the anti-fragile supply chain, when it's been disrupted or just pushed and bent and everything, it actually gets stronger. So it's like your muscles. So if I go to the gym, I work out, I break muscle fibers. but then they reform and they're stronger.
Stronger than before, yeah.
So in order to be able to do that, what we have to do is it's not just about, prepare, get the readiness in place, respond, recover. It's then we have to relearn. So we have to learn. What we then have to do is to re-engineer our supply chains, right? Then we have to relaunch, and then we have to reinvigorate them. So effectively what we've got is we've got the 3 R's and then the 4 R's, right? To be able to move into that new world. And that's really important. And we have seen businesses starting to do this. So effectively they're going beyond resilience. So if you're out there and you're suddenly thinking, oh no, this is all doom and destruction, what am I going to actually do? See it as a big learning opportunity, because we learn more from those times when we're under pressure than any other time. I always loved a quote from Winston Churchill, one of the prime minister many years ago. And he actually said, the definition of success is moving from failure to failure with enthusiasm, right? And I like that, because what we have to do, and this is where we have to have a culture where failure is accepted, but when we have a failure, we learn from that failure and we can move forward. So, you might be sitting there thinking, what on earth am I going to do? How am I going to do this? You might be in a very reactive state at the moment, but, don't lose your head over it.
Sure.
What you've got to be able to do is to say, okay, what can we learn from this? What are the things we need to put in place to be able to move forward more effectively?
I love this idea of anti-fragile supply chain. And you mentioned the 3 R's and 4 R's. So if you have to put into a framework, what would be the framework for this to achieving the, let's call it, anti-fragile supply chain?
Well, I think the key thing is that we now have this capability of learning.
Yeah.
So before, one of the reasons, I'll let you into the secret, the reason why I, stay in business effectively is because most companies have very short corporate memories. They're a bit like Goldfish, so they do a project and they sort everything out, and then they forget about it. New people come in and everything else.
They start
and they start again, and all of a sudden they phone me up and say, oh, Richard, can you come along and do this? And I'm going, hang on a minute, let me just have a look on my laptop. I did this project with you, a few years ago. We're going to go through it again. And part of that is because, they just forget what's actually going on. But I think there's a real opportunity now, because if you think about learning, what we're able to do is we're able to use tools to help us learn. Because when I started my career, we were doing some big research projects. This was back in the early 90s. And we were talking about we needed gigabyte drives, just to keep all this knowledge. And we were thinking we're going to have like a knowledge base, a knowledge center where we can keep all this stuff together. And then, more recently, we're saying, there's been on big company portals, this is only like 5-10 years ago, where we've been going through supply chain projects, capturing learnings, putting them on there so that employees can actually access them. But of course, half the time they don't know where this stuff is and everything else.
Yeah.
But now, of course, we've got AI.
Yes.
And, the AI systems are able to actually interrogate that, pull the lessons out, find these projects, find these learnings, bring them front of mind again for new employees coming in.
Yeah.
So they're able to actually do that. So, we've now got tools which actually enable us to relearn more effectively. What we've also got, if we're going back to supply chain diversification, we've actually got the computing analytics, so we can look at those multiple routes,
data,
multiple channels, work out the cost to serve, and so on and so forth. If we're clear on what's actually going on, so that becomes quite important.
I'll come back to the AI and the topic of resilience, but I want to touch base you talk about resilience, right? So, for example, I was working for Eaton, and my VP for the business used to pressurize me. Oh, we need to be agile. I was like, okay, do you really understand what agile means? Anyway, so I explained to him. But he's got a point though, that we should be able to respond faster when there's a shortage. You have to reduce the lead time. I get the point. Then he read somewhere, maybe heard a podcast about resilience, and then he said, I want to be resilience, right? So it's okay. If you want to have a more resilient supply chain, multi-sourcing, and all the good 3 R's you talked about, it comes with the cost. At the same time, he put me pressure, you got to take the $2 million off. So I see that as a triangle, which is very, very hard to balance, right? That, okay, if you want to be, and so, this whole thing of cost, price, and quality. Yeah, if you want quality, you have to pay more money. If you pay faster, you have to pay more money. You can't have all of them together. So I see that triangle with the same dilemma, right? So my perspective, and that's why I'm picking with you and love to hear your thoughts, that it's very hard to be to have resilient supply chain, agile supply chain, and save cost at the same time. You have to invest in the supply chain design to have the agility you want, right? With the nodes and shorter lead time with multi-sourcing and the resilience as well. I mean, you're a great researcher. What do you think?
Right. So I think one of the key things is often people go in and say, oh, we need an agile supply chain that can solve all our problems. As you've already pointed out, agile supply chains, if you're going to have a super agile supply chain, there is a cost associated with that. So one of the big things that we've been looking at for a number of years, and in fact, if you go and have a look at the 2022 Defence Supply Chain Strategy for the UK, you go on the government website in the United Kingdom, and you can find this. I wrote the forward for it.
Wow.
Okay. And what we actually were playing around with there was something which we call the bimodal supply chain. So we have mode 1 and mode 2. And so the supply chain actually flips between these two modes. So mode 1 is your lean, stable supply chain. Now that operates in a very stable way. So if we look at a lot of products within organizations, it used to be that, you know, most of the products that we were dealing with would be, if you like, those mode 1 things that we could manage in a very lean way. The challenge was that 20% of them were those ones which were you can't manage in that way. These are the ones which have high volatility associated with them. You need flexibility, you need different ways of working. And so what you would actually end up doing was, in some organizations, would have to separate literally separate out the supply chains. You might even have a lean manufacturing facility and a agile manufacturing facility, because it requires completely different ways of thinking,
design,
and manufacturing, the machinery you're using, everything, the nature structure of the supply chain. So what we would do is manage those two things. The big challenge has been, of course, is if we think about supply chains over the last 6 years, COVID came along, everything was sort of 80% mode 1, 20% mode 2. You know, I'm just picking statistics out of the way. All of a sudden it flipped. So we ended up with, you know, it's now 20% mode 1 and then, you know, like 80% mode 2. So that actually means that you have to reconfigure the nature of the supply chain. And when I'm looking at supply chain strategy, because, you know, I've got this wonderful title, Emeritus Professor of Supply Chain Strategy, when I'm looking at supply chain strategy, really there's 4 key things that you're playing with. You know, it's a simplification, but 4 key things. You've got your process design, your infrastructure network design, the information systems design, and then the organization and people. Okay. Now, if you're wanting a nice lean supply chain, you can have different processes, a different network and infrastructure. You're going to have different information systems having to run, and you're probably going to have different people who are focused on different things. When it moves to agile, once again, those things will change again. So we have these multiple things operating, and so you can't have an average supply chain, because an average supply chain basically means that 50% of your customers are sick of you, and the other 50% are spending too much money on. So this trade-off that you're talking about, it is achievable, but you have to basically separate things out. Think of mode 1, think of mode 2, and recognize that products, even a product during its life cycle, will flip between those different modes. So when you're in product launch, you're going to need an agile supply chain because you don't quite know what's going on. What will then happen is it'll ramp and it'll stabilize. That's where you can put your lean supply chain in place. So you want to manage it in a different way. Then when the product is, you know, coming to the end of its life cycle, that's where the volatility starts to kick in again, and you need to actually manage that differently. So really recognizing and segmenting supply chains in that way becomes quite important, and having that recognition within your organization. And then you're able to actually, you know, manage things. Now, it's still a tough call.
It's tough call,
but it is very possible. And you might turn around and say, oh, well, you know, we've got to use, you know, we've got all these big sheds, warehouses around the world. We've got to use those for my agile supply chain as well. Well, that might be the case, but you might use different modes of transport, you know, so, you know, air can be a lot faster than boats and so on and so forth. But you don't want to put too much stuff on it.
Yeah.
Don't take the average.
I'm just worried right now this podcast is going to be long because I'm loving talking to you. But so you mentioned process design, network design, systems design, and the people reorganization, right? And I work for industry 17 years and I do consultancy as well. So everybody naturally focus on process design. Okay, we need to get more talent in or upgrade the current talent. This is where SCMDOJO would come in and the process design will come in. And then they talk about systems. So they, better ERP system, integrated system for whatever, WMS, MS, whatever. But I think they hardly focus on then the whole supply chain network design. So before I finish my question, I wrote on LinkedIn a lot and I have this theory. When business start organically, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, even now, right? And as you mentioned, they call you again for the same problem. And I think the reason it happens is the network design is people don't think of supply chain leaders or even the C-level leaders. They don't see that as a strategic initiative to review the whole thing and then decide what to change, right? This hardly happen. Okay, they might look into the transportation network design, but that's one element of the full supply chain network design, right? So why, and they don't hardly do this because, for example, I'm consulting a business, they were $5 million, they're grown up, good business in healthcare. Now they have a lot of retail agencies in Middle East. Now they're 20 million, they're pretty happy, but supply chain is crap, right? When I just go and tell them, mate, you have to do the whole thing redesign, and they said, they literally think, I don't know what I'm talking about. So would you agree with this worry, or what do you suggest? How people solve this problem of the network design of supply chain?
The big challenge,
strategically,
strategically at a high level, what we have to remember is that they are big investments when we're thinking about the network.
Yeah.
So if you're thinking about warehousing in the United Kingdom, what they're actually looking at is often they're saying we're going to build that facility and we want it to last for 50 years. We want it to last for 50 years. Now, we can't even predict what's going on in the next 3 years. So what you end up doing is you push a load of equipment in. So what it used to be said, the biggest failures in warehouses used to be foundations, not putting in the foundations, because, if we go back in and look at older facilities, you'd put in foundations which aren't strong enough now to support the robotics, the mezzanine floors and everything else that we actually need to be able to make these things support. So in a way, when we're actually building and thinking about new facilities, we need to actually build that in. Now, the next question then is, with your network, is, do I really want to own anything anymore? So you get to this point of, asking the question, can I borrow it? Right?
Yeah.
Can I share it? Yeah. And then finally, you might get to the point where you say, well, do I actually need to buy my own?
Yeah.
Because I would argue that things are pretty volatile now. And so therefore, if you're thinking about these things, you're probably better off having leases, but those leases being more short-term and renewable, because you don't know the way things will change. Yeah. I mean, I always reflect on, I did some work with the biotechnology sector in Cambridge. And one of the interesting things about them was that they would form supply chains for creating, basically it was often molecules and things like that, which could then be sold to big pharmaceutical companies to solve a problem. So if we think about lots of the modern drugs we see, it starts off with, these small companies trying to actually do things together. And what would happen is they would have a big meeting in Cambridge, and these were quite regular, where everybody used to come along and they used to have 5-minute pitches on a stage, just sharing, this is what we can do, this is our capability, we're doing this, 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 and this. And then the next person would come and be sharing something else. What would then happen was, a big chunk of this was networking. People would come up and say, you had that idea about this. Well, we've got this. And we could join those two together, which would then do this. And if we get that person over there, they can join in as well. So they'd form a little supply chain. Now, the whole purpose of that supply chain is to create value for that final pharmaceutical company. But then what would happen is, of course, they would then hopefully sell that value. But quite often it would, the value, they would sell it, then that supply chain would dissolve. They didn't maintain things. They basically said, okay, we'll just maintain the relationships, but let it dissolve. And then what would happen is they'd find another opportunity to create value, and they'll join different people up again, right? Now, why don't we do that in physical supply chain structures? At the end of the day, value is changing within the world, within our customer base. So if we're locking in on a particular network, it might create value today, but in 3 years' time, people might not want it like that, We're
Certainly so fast.
Yeah, go back. I mean, I love to go back to, when I was a lad, go back 50 years ago, what you actually had, no internet. If you were buying stuff, the nearest you got to eBay or something like that was a magazine called Exchange and Mart magazine. And this was like a newspaper. It was like really fat. And you would just go through all these adverts, and you'd find a little company which was selling what you wanted, and then you would buy it. When you bought it, you'd use something called a postal order, right? Okay. That was the way we managed cash. So I'd go to our local post office and I'd pay some money over, and they'd write out this postal order. You would then put that in an envelope and send it to them. And they used to say, allow 28 days delivery. And you think now I can go on my app on Amazon and I can get something delivered to me in 2 hours.
Yeah.
Right? Now, the infrastructure required for allowed 28 days delivery is very different to the infrastructure required for 2 hours. So, and it's the same with all the other things, think about the processes required in that situation. Think about, as we've been talking about network, what about the information systems and so on and so forth.
Quality.
And then when we do something different, so say we put an additive manufacturing into a warehouse, and we no longer need so much of all this racking and everything else, it also changes the processes. It also changes the information systems requirement, but it also changes the skills of the people and the organization needed to actually manage that. So we get this, across those 4 dimensions, we get these things sort of changing as time goes on.
So that's perfect. So that leads, and this information systems and need for agility make total sense. So we can't continue this interview without talking about AI and the positive disruption it's bringing in. So my thesis is following, right? I think the hype of AI going to replace the job in some cases is valuable, but it's almost like a snake oil effect of AI, right? I don't think even in 5 years, of course, the CEO of Microsoft AI system, Mustafa, said on the Financial Times on the 12th of Feb, I read this article that 80% of the white collar job will be obsolete in 18 months' time. I think too aggressive. Of course, they have to say that because they're selling AI systems. In reality, will not happen, because I'm just trusting our human being, because we are so resistant to change, especially in supply chain more so than others. And everything you explained, how difficult it is to look into the strategy from the strategy side, the people, the process, the system, it's hard, right? But considering the two ends of the let's call it horizon, but I think the human AI will bring a lot of qualitative changes, especially the human-centric supervised AI. So keeping this resilience and the risk topic in mind, though that's the main theme they're running, where you see the biggest contributors are of AI, which people should start leveraging sooner rather than later for all the to make this anti-fragile supply chain, as you mentioned.
Okay, so I think, one of the key things, so I have this temple of supply chain resilience, right? Which I've, you can find it on LinkedIn. You can do the LinkedIn learning course on risk and resilience, which I have out there as well.
By the way, congratulations, that course is pretty famous.
It's doing well at the moment. It's doing well. I think it was over 67,000 learners are on that. But when we actually look at that, the foundation of all this is supply chain strategy. So many businesses don't really understand that. And so you've got to have, that focused supply chain strategy, thinking about how you're creating value, think about, those 4 key areas which you've been talking about. But then what we have to think about is, yes, we need to have agility where it's appropriate. You need the right culture. We need collaboration. There's no doubt about that as well. And so we have to have those things in place. But really the top level, and this is where AI really comes in, is continuous monitoring and intelligence and supply chain transparency. And what AI has managed to really do is using particular tools, it can actually focus down using free data, like, the standard, shipping data and location codes and everything else, and identify where supply chains are actually going. This becomes quite exciting. What we can then do is we can have monitoring systems in place. So when disruptions occur, you get a signal. You still need some human intelligence to look at it and say, is this actually something which we need to get concerned about? But I really think that that's one of the things that is actually going on. We can spot things remarkably quickly in terms of what's going on.
Yeah.
So if we just go back to COVID, I remember just when it was starting to kick off, I had a load of I was running a course at Cranfield, physical course at Cranfield. I had a load of people on there, and they were going, something's going on in China at the moment. We've got some challenges on these shipping routes, on these rivers, this, that, and the other. So we knew there was something going, and everybody was on their phones, sort of phoning around, trying to work out what was going on. But it was before, this is only 6 years ago. And so a lot of all that, if you like, information data was just coming out, and we go, yep, we've definitely got something going on, but it was up to us to actually pull it all in.
Yeah.
Now you can literally have a system sitting there monitoring social media feeds, this, that, and the other, pulling it all together, and identifying where issues are actually taking place, what's actually going on.
Right.
So I think that's going to be one of the key things that we can use it for. The whole thing about, will it mean that everybody will be out of work pretty quickly? I think things can continue to develop. Skills are going to change. So critical thinking skills are going to be the key thing that everybody's going to be looking for. And I often say, if we're thinking about RPA, robot process or automation, the key thing with that is what is it really all about? It's taking the robot out of the human. So those repetitive, boring tasks that we do every day, we go in and we, pull up that spreadsheet, put some more numbers into it, and we do this and do that. All that needs to go, because actually we need to use, our creativity, our critical thinking to look at what's actually going on. So I think some of those jobs are going to go. That does present a big challenge, though. So the big challenge is if you think about those graduate level jobs where you'd get people into a business, you'd help them really understand, the basics of what was happening. It was those types of jobs which were, that you'd get people doing initially. Now, if all of those have gone,
which it will, I think.
Yeah, what is going to happen then to talent development? Because you can't just push them in and, at these higher level thinking things, you've got to actually develop people. But I think that's probably going to be something which is above my pay grade to think about. So, but it's something we need.
I think this is a chasm we are developing. And I know you said above your pay grade. I want to slightly discuss this more. I'm going to give you an example. So, for SCMDOJO, we used to have 6 coders, right? 1 senior coder, 1 like mid-senior, and 4 junior, who basically, this is the functionality, take this in Python or React, just code, and the senior 2 guys used to put it together. Now, with the advent of Cursor and other Gen AI coding platform, which is now 3-4 years, has gone really big, lovable on the HTML side, basically our coding team is half, and our output is 3 times more, right? Because the basic code which the coders used to write is just done by AI, and our 2 senior coders, they basically just put it together, use the interface, and the 3rd guy do the QA testing, right? So 3 people, we have more output. As you rightly said, this whole mundane, repetitive task we used to give it to graduates, it will not be there because nobody wants to keep it. Now, that creates a strategic challenge for the senior leaders in the supply chain business, right? You're still going to need people. So what jobs are you going to give them to do it? So I'm going to relate this with this whole point of education, because you have been professor of Cranfield, right? So how universities or education system in general are preparing the graduates to not to be ready, or because these repetitive jobs will not be there. So how they're going to get in and straight away jump into a demand planner who understand business, for example, because that will be the minimum job available, not like because my first job at ETA, believe me or not, it was, even while I was studying PhD, I was expediter paid 4.50 an hour. This is how I started my career. My job was simple. Somebody was placing PO and that person was busy. I have to call suppliers and just ask them, where's my stuff? Literally, and go and update into a spreadsheet. I did that for 3 months, then got a job of a buyer, then demand planner. This will not be required because AI automation didn't doing it. So how we going to get our next generation motivated to join supply chain? So the talent is needed always.
Yeah, and I think that that's going to be it is really the question. How do we get the next generation to join supply chain? I mean, I was chairman of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport all those years ago, and that was still the question we were.
And you're also with CISA.
So yeah, that's right. With the Chartered Institute Procurement and Supply, I'm on the board of directors, trustee of that. So what one of the big challenges is how do we get people, into these particular areas. And I think that one is people need to recognize, just how good a career is, but most people end up in it by accident. I think it's fair to say, if we're thinking about all your listeners, how many actually suddenly thought to themselves, I really want to have a supply chain job, or I really want a logistics. It's something that you sort of fall into. Procurement in a way, the nature of that is now we're finding more people are saying, that's what I want to do. That is where I want to actually be and focus. So these things are slowly changing, but it's really the skill levels which are required to actually get into it, as you're pointing out. So the universities, if we think about what's actually going on in the universities, I often talk about, there's two sets of skills that you need to be able to operate in a business. You need the technical skill set, and IQ skills, as it were, of logistics. This is, warehousing, some planning, that type of stuff. But also then we've got the EQ, the relational skills, which are absolutely key. And I think that I would argue that universities haven't been particularly great at developing the relational skill set. And I think that that's where it's slowly starting to do. We need that critical thinking and that relational skill set. And how we develop that is becoming more important, because the basic IQ of supply chains, that's going to be something which AI is going to be able to suck all the intelligence out of and repackage. But the relational side of things, that's going to be really important. And so it's one of the interesting things. So if I think about the LinkedIn Learning course, a big part of that as well is using international standard ISO 44000, which is all about collaborative business relationships. Most people don't realize there's an international standard to get you thinking about how do we actually manage relationships. And that is really key to resilience in supply chains, how we manage relationships. So, that's why it's one of those things that, yes, we've got ISO 31000, which is, risk management and so on and so forth. But another international standard is how we manage relationships. And I think that that's an area that we need to develop, those critical thinking and relationship management.
I think you rightly mentioned, and before I move to the futuristic topic, which I think we have in the discussion point, the thing with relationship is, it's almost like dating and practice, right? The more you date, the better you get, right? The more you talk to people, the better you get in communication. The more you present, the confidence you up. The more you become, deploy your leadership skills, the better you get. So a young graduate, it's well and good in saying it. If you see all the university curriculums, there is no project which is going to say, this project or this content going to help you become a better EQ in supply chain or going to improve your critical thinking. So I think there's a call to action on the academia side as well. I think this is...
we used to, I ran some really innovative supply chain courses at Cranfield with my colleagues. And one of those courses, I always remember it because it was quite funny. We'd have a load of senior supply chain people coming along. And the morning was all the technical stuff, so it's how you do inventory management, how you do warehousing, supply chain strategy. In the afternoon, we used to get in a group of people who were from our praxis group. Okay. Now, what this group were, they were people who were, actors and things like that. And they'd say, right, okay, supply chain directors, we'd like you're going to lie on the floor now. We just want you to breathe. Anyway, you can imagine they're all freaking out going, what do you mean? Just breathe and think and then do all this. We want to do action. This is thing.
Yeah.
But a key part of that was we knew that we had to actually develop these soft skills. So we'd use completely different people to completely disrupt their worlds. And in fact, we would get them doing lessons from, Shakespeare and things like that. And part of that was, believe it or not, you can train EQ into people. You can improve people's EQ. You can improve their relational intelligence. So we can actually develop programs to develop people's relational intelligence. So it shouldn't be something which is by accident, as in, let's go on 1,000 dates and see what we learn from it. Because, if you pick up bad habits, you're going to continue to apply those bad habits and go, why did it all go wrong? Whereas if you're actually within that, they can say, right, this is what's happening. So, using also, it's about actually understanding ourselves as well, understanding ourselves and how we act in different situations, those things that are annoying, like, sometimes I talk far too much and so on and so forth, so you just need to be able to recognize that and learn listening skills. So we can train it. And I think that's the key point. So we can get that critical thinking skills and we can get those relational management, those EQ skills, the technical intelligence. We do need some of that. There's no doubt about it. We need that technical intelligence. But, at the end of the day, it's about saying, how can we take that technical intelligence to a slightly higher level to enable our supply chains to work better.
And applying the technical skills using the EQ skills is very important. So in 2023, you have predicted this, I think, 5 areas of supply chain trends, right? Okay. So now we are in 2020, almost 2026 right now. So what's your reflection? Have you changed those? You want to add something? Maybe we can.
Well, I have. Yeah, I'm gonna pinch me a bit of paper. I actually wrote it down because I was thinking about this. Yeah. So what we did in 2023, I was like looking out there and say, well, what are the big global trends that we see? And I didn't look at, you don't put in, supply chain trends. What are the supply chain trends, all the big trends? But what I was looking at was global mega trends from multiple sources. So even if you're looking at consumer, buying trends and various other things. And what we came up with, there was 5 key things. And it's where, I've got it written down, so I'll just read them.
Yeah.
Those were global economic inflation and consumer loss of purchasing power. Well, we're still seeing that today. Technology and digitization, of course, we're seeing that. Sustainability and ESG, totally important, and we're still seeing that. Changing demographics and talent challenge. We've been reflecting on that now, and we're seeing that accelerating in a way. Changing demographics, of course, in some countries we have very, very young populations, and others it's aging populations. So it's a challenge whichever way it goes. The multipolar world and geopolitics, multiple centers of power and influence. Well, we're seeing even more of that now. And then the 2 which have really come up again, really on, which everybody's talking about is cybersecurity and digital supply chain risks. And we're just seeing that. We've seen some big supply chains being disrupted. And we're even seeing supply chains being disrupted. Literally.
Jaguar Land Rover was off for months because of the hike.
Absolutely. We've had the co-op. We've had various people being disrupted by that. But another one is critical materials and resource scarcity. And of course, we're seeing even more of that now. So, this is one of those things. But I do very much see it's also an opportunity. So if we're thinking about, our critical materials and resource scarcity, if we get, ESG right, we're able to, so if you think about it, we've got battery management, recycling of electronic items and so on and so forth. If we do that right, we can actually solve some of these other resource scarcities. So the things we used to throw away, now we need to actually retain the value. So when I think about forward logistics, just going through to the customer, that is, if you like, value being co-created. What then happens is we need to go back down, how do we get it back into the ground effectively so that we can reuse it? That's all about value retention. How do we retain value? And so that's what we're seeing now in, electric vehicle batteries is a great example.
Yeah.
What they're wanting to do is, in Europe particularly, they're saying we've got these electric vehicle batteries. We need to know the life cycle of those. Often it's only 1 or 2 cells which are failing. So are we able to, keep the good stuff, reject the, bad stuff, but then we're able to actually use that to do something new with it. So, actually thinking differently becomes very, very important as we move forward.
In this critical materials, I would also want to include this situation with AI and what they call it special metals, right? Because most of this AI data centers, right, or the chips require those special metals, right? So if you want to add something here, so would you put AI in one of the 6 bullet?
I put AI goes into my technology and digitization. Yeah, I mean, I did in there have, if you like, some of the cybersecurity side of things, because that was my number 1 in the digitization. Because when we're looking at supply chain 4.0, what we start to actually think through is that we've got various, if you like, building blocks which all come together, and cloud, Internet of Things, loads of things that we, the digital twins, we've got all these things coming together, and AI just builds on those issues. I mean, we've been talking about it. I mean, an interesting one which seems to be getting less talk at the moment is, blockchain.
Yeah, I think.
I always remember this. So we have these supply chain things, which everybody thinks the next big thing is going to be blockchain. And I think in certain environments, the proof of provenance, very, very important. But, blockchain, as we were talking about it probably 3 or 4 years ago, I think all that's changed.
Yeah, I've done a bit of research on this, and I tell you with example what happened to that. So the biggest case study, or at that point, was the collision between Maersk and IBM.
Yeah,
they created TradeLens, right? Just the whole idea. It on paper and theory sounds perfect, right? That all the documentation, all the trade, everything happened on the blockchain. It's you can track it, you can trace it, you can manage. But the problem with blockchain, or especially supply chain, is you can't do that without taking government and banks outside, because most of the transactions has to go through customs, right?
Yeah.
And most of the money has to go through banks. And banks and governments don't want to be in that blockchain, because if they go into blockchain, they lose centralized control, right? And just because of the I think lack of political lobbying, I would say, because probably Maersk and IBM would have done a better job even in one country with lobby. Maybe Dubai would be a good example. Maybe Estonia would be a good example, because you just need one good digital government to agree to that. Okay, that all the trade in Estonia, or maybe all the trade in Dubai, gonna happen in blockchain in the system called TradeLens, and they would have a great success story. It just didn't kick off, and therefore blockchain as a technology died, because government and banks want to control the direction.
And I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think customs, blockchain to some extent is being used by customers, but of course they want the key. They want to see where everything has come from. But maybe potentially what AI has done is it's found other ways of showing provenance.
Provenance, yes.
So if we're using the codes which are used every time a shipment is moved, where it's from, and so on and so forth, those are freely available and are pretty well standardized. So by looking at those and interrogating those, you can probably get the same provenance information. But I haven't looked at it for a while, so I'm pleased you've had a look at it.
That's great. Good. TradeLens is shut down after spending millions.
Yeah,
they have to shut down few years ago. So I want to take opportunity of talking to you, because you're visionary. You know what's going on in supply chain strategic level, especially as you said, you're a professor. When I see that list, right, and I think about my job previously, or my customers who are supply chain leaders, maybe except the critical materials one, you got to be dealing with 4 or 5 of them simultaneously.
Yeah.
So you got to keep an eye and keep your roadmap and try to basically minimize the fires and the blind spots you have. And you also got to run in supply chain, right? Then it becomes the juggling of the ball case. So what you would say, okay, pick these 2 or 3, focus on them, and then you move to the next. So can you prioritize this list? I know it's hard choice to prioritize, but would you, if you have to give them strategic advice, what you would give?
It would very much depend on the sector that
They are
you're
in.
working in and what the company is. And I think this is one of those that's one of those questions like saying which is the best football team in the world, or which is, can you create the best football team in the world? Yeah, Arsenal. So what we end up saying is you go, oh yeah, I'd have that player and I'd have this player and I'll do this and I'll bring it all together, but that never happens. So what people often say, which is the best supply chain in the world, and you're going, well, hang on a minute, you can't compare with it, because that supply chain in the meat industry is the best possible supply chain in the meat industry, or that supply chain in the mineral water bottled industry is the best supply chain in that thing. But you can learn from them, you can learn lessons from them, but you can't really sort of say this is the best. It's the best at creating value that the customers actually want. So when I come to that list, if I'm looking at the things that we really need to think about, we really need to deal with, I think at the moment the big ones in the boardroom, you get your cybersecurity right. That can sink your business. If you don't get that right, you're going to be in big trouble in the short term. And I think it's really important to remember, it's not a matter of stopping it ever happening. Also recognize it will happen to you. You've got to have the attitude it will happen to you, right?
Yeah.
It's just when.
Very good example.
It's when.
It's when.
So I mean, one of the big things is everyone goes, oh yeah, well, we've got a plan. It's on a PDF document on my computer.
Or my IT.
Oh, guess what? Your computer doesn't work anymore. So guess what we need to do? Remember those lovely lever arch files? Remember those things you used to have? Have you got a lever arch file? Oh well, I've got all the phone numbers I need on my iPhone. Yeah. Hang on a minute. It's in digital. You need it written down.
Yeah.
And so starting to think really differently about how we deal with cyber, work on the principle that you cannot use anything electronic. Make sure you've got some plan there for that. Yeah. So I'd go with that one. That would be one of my first things that I think you've got to really recognize and deal with. I think the next one, so that's if you like a short to medium term, thinking through cybersecurity, recognizing that you will get hit at some point. So what can we do about that? I think that then in a longer term, I think we need to think about the changing demographics and talent challenge. So the debate we've been having,
yes,
because that will be hitting your business maybe 3 to 10 years time.
Yes.
How are we going to develop people? How are we going to bring in those skills? Thinking about those EQ skills, those critical thinking skills, where are they going to come from, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So that's a bit more of a longer.
Not just that, actually. I would, if you don't mind, I would add is to upgrading the skills of the current team.
Yeah.
With the technology advancement, which is going super fast, changing every 3 months, to get to the point they can use the existing tools available.
Yeah. And this is it. I mean, I always find it quite amusing because, I've been using Microsoft Office since it was probably invented, so,
34 years ago.
I don't know how long ago it was. But anyway, I've been using it for all those years, and I can tell you now, I still don't use all of it. You know what I mean? It's like, I still do things in crazy ways. And in fact, thank you, ChatGPT. I found new ways of doing stuff. Like I was getting frustrated trying to back up a computer and doing this. So I asked ChatGPT, found a load of functionality I never knew even existed in Windows. So, actually those, I was doing it in the same way over and over again, not looking for a new way.
Okay.
So looking for those new ways and innovating, is really key, and I think that's going to be quite important.
So it's already an hour. I know you've been kind with your time, right? And we have, by the way, a curry plan in the famous curry hub.
We're going to have the Professor Richard Curry. in Rugby, so we're going to be doing that, which is going to be really exciting.
Exactly,
yes,
right.
so
post a picture on LinkedIn as well tomorrow. So I want to just move towards the end of it, but before I have a section in my podcast called QUICKFIRE, right? Whatever comes in my mind, you have to answer quickly. But before that. So we see I think we had when I was in Dubai, we had the first Zoom interview call almost 3-4 years ago. And you've seen the journey of SCMDOJO. So if you And I really like to be, on advisor to us. So if you have to, what do you think about how we have done? If you have to give us one advice, what you would give us?
So one bit of advice. Oh gosh, I think one of the key things is we just need to keep talking supply chain. We need to keep on doing it so that everybody recognizes the importance of this.
Yes.
So if we go back, even back to those Zoom days, supply chains were a big surprise for politicians and all sorts of people. It's still a surprise for politicians and some people, but I think we're starting to get the word out there. So, doing these initiatives, actually working, communicating, being proud of supply chain, I think is a really important thing to do.
That's correct. But recently, since you are almost like the, I would call it a face of supply chain in UK. You go to BBC, you go to channels, you're pretty famous person in at least in the supply chain space. I've seen recently this Supply Chain Act published in Canada, in USA. I don't see a lot of more, let's call it, acts coming around from the government level, right, supporting the supply chain. I mean, I might be wrong, because I just want to take a...
I think that one of the challenges that we have is government is trying to manage something which often they don't understand the interconnectedness of things. Also, I think it's fair to say that politicians, when they intervene, generally end up with unintended consequences which come out of it. And, we see that on, in the United Kingdom with energy pricing, things like that. There are unintended consequences. And I think that that's part of the problem is, going back to my early work, when I got my PhD in, it was around chaos and complexity science and supply chains. And that interconnectedness is really, really important to understand. And sometimes you say, yes, what we need to be able to do is we need to, at the end of the day, things need to be economically sustainable, environmentally sustainable, but also really importantly, socially sustainable, our communities and our people. And that's in a way what we're starting to see because of the shifts which are going on. Our politicians, one of the things that they can do is to actually think about social sustainability. How can we actually maintain the prosperity in our societies and the things that they're doing? And that may be where effectively legislation starts to come into play. So, if we're thinking about a big focus on a lot of supply chain legislation has been, could be conflict minerals or modern day slavery. That's most of it. And they're wanting to know, and they're holding directors to account for those particular things. And I think that type of legislation is important because at the end of the day, when a supply chain manager is under pressure, thinking I need to buy stuff cheaply, and they're not really thinking through what are the consequences of buying this stuff cheaply. Somebody is going to be paying somewhere. So, I often say, if we're thinking about free delivery and free returns, it's not free.
It's not free.
Somebody is paying for it. Somebody is paying. And if you're not paying for it, could it be the courier who isn't being paid enough? Could it be somebody else who isn't getting it? So on and so forth. So, we've got to think through those societal impacts of what we're doing.
That's correct. Now, last section, quick fire. No long answers, right? So it's going to be short and quick. So let's do that. So the first one is, if you're not a professor of supply chain or if you're not in supply chain field, what will you be doing?
I think I would be buying, selling, collecting watches. I love watches. That's one of my things.
What you want to do.
We need to, I'm a member of the British Clock and Watchmakers Alliance.
Really?
And
it's a thing.
Okay. So there you go.
All right. Okay. That's an action, right? Okay. And for example, so you are an angel with a superpower, right? Let's call Gabriel, for example. And you have to give one superpower to all supply chain people to make their life easier, quicker, efficient, right? What superpower you would give them?
You know what? I think it would be the ability to get 8 hours sleep a night.
I sleep 5.5, 6, you're right.
Yeah.
It's bad. So that would be a thing. I would take that.
Because I think it would be better decisions and all sorts of stuff. Get a good night's sleep.
Definitely. Thank you. Good one. Okay, so if you have to take out one word from supply chain or supply chain research, banned it totally, what that word would be?
ecosystems and what the other.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm hearing all. They're talking about eco. Basically, it's words that you can't explain simply and create complete confusion in people's minds. So it's all that sort of, dare I say it, consultancy jargon.
Yeah.
Seeing the presentations and everything else. Yeah, that's
So
what I'm
that I like.
And acronyms.
Acronyms.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I'm too many.
Too many of them.
Yeah.
Too many of them. Once I was driving, I was calling to my colleague, and I was just using OTD, days of hand, all that. And my son said, "What is this language you speak? Are you speaking English?" I was like, "Yeah, but there are lots of acronyms in the conversation." Okay, if you give a theme song to your research or your, all the books you have written, or all your research, actually, what you would give?
A
song.
song.
A theme song, yeah.
A theme song. Oh gosh, that's a good one. I'm trying to think of a song.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of a song. Oh gosh. I think, if you like, the song or the tune which would go through all of that.
Yeah.
I think it would be, there's a crazy little song which they sing in the church with the children, which is about a great big God. Because sometimes I think, where is this stuff coming
Where
from?
this is coming from.
And you just have to say, our God is a
Yeah.
great big God.
Yeah.
So somebody's in control.
Right.
It's not our politicians. So yeah, we've got
That's right. Next one. So if you have to, what is the weirdest research idea you've ever come across in supply chain? Like weird, like crazy research idea.
Oh, crazy research areas. I would say some of the crazy ones which I've found have been sort of just looking at, well, the craziest research areas are always the ones which are trying to fix a problem which doesn't really exist.
Yes.
Yeah. So you suddenly find there's one on, let's join up everybody's home delivery and have, grocery home delivery done by one provider, and all the supermarkets feed into that. Well, it's not going to happen. Why? Because each provider, their value and their customer service and everything else all revolves around that delivery van. And what you're talking about there is just delivering. It's not the customer's service experience. So if I have a Morrison's delivery with one supermarket to my house, I will probably get a particular driver, and he will act in a particular way, and so on and so forth. And he knows me, and there's a relationship. It's back to relationships. And, if I have one from the Sainsbury's, it'll be a different person, but probably the same person. And it's about that relationship. So, there's never going to be a way of doing it unless it's just a matter of, standard bits of food, being pushed through.
Last two, right? So if you have to pick one of the British Prime Minister to be a supply chain manager, who would you pick?
A Prime Minister to be a
you could go as far as this.
I go right back in time.
Yeah, you can pick any.
Oh dear. I like Churchill. I like his attitude.
Yeah.
So I like,
he would have traded it.
Well, yeah. When he had it, he was good. He was motivation.
Yeah.
He had those people skills, I think, for what he needed to achieve at the time. Yeah. Of course, he was kicked out of Parliament after because he was a man for the moment. I think that's what we have to remember, is we need those politicians for the moment. And in supply chain, I believe it's a similar thing. You need a supply chain man for that moment, creating value in a particular way for that particular supply chain, and then somebody else might want to come in and sort it out.
Do a little, right? Yeah. Last one. If your students has to rate you like an Uber driver, right, and write a review, what do you think they would write?
If they were going to write a review, I think sometimes they would probably say I'm pretty distant, but I think the key thing is that I try to explain things in very simple terms.
Yes.
Which is why I hate all those acronyms and everything else, because if I don't really understand what the word means and what people are talking about, or it can be misinterpreted, it needs to be simplified and presented in a way which is simple. So, I've always said, I'm sorry this is a long answer, but I've always said, at the end of the day, when you're writing for the press, which is what I used to do, if you're writing for the Financial Times, you write for a reasonably well-educated child of the age 12 to 14.
So,
So if you read their articles, a 12 to 14-year-old can read those articles.
that makes sense.
And, and probably some of the other British newspapers, and a 3-year-old might be able to actually understand them. But the point is you have to get it to that level.
Yeah.
And what we actually do is we often make things too complicated.
Yeah.
For people to really understand. And if it's too complicated and you go in and talk a load of jargon, you lose your right to speak in the boardroom.
I certainly second that, because at SCMDOJO, we have a very old member. She's our customer. Her name is Stacey Sarawan. She's a supply chain manager in Trinidad, right? I was talking to you and I mentioned that I'm going to interview. She said, "Oh, I was a student at Cranfield of Dr. Richard." He exactly said everything you said. Things explained simply so we can understand, and he thinks your sense of humor is great, as we have seen today. So thank you very much for your time. I love talking to you.
Thank you.
Right. It's been a pleasure. Hopefully again, thank you again. Hopefully you like this video. Just leave the comments. And if you like Dr. Richard, again, we live 1 hour
Check
away.
out the website, richardwilding.info.
Exactly.
Check me out on LinkedIn. Do me calls. Click like and subscribe. Do you do that?
We do. That's what we Yeah, click like, share, subscribe. Leave a comment, and we live 1 hour away. If you like me to have Dr. Richard again on a specific topic, please do leave it. Thank you very much. Bye.
And come to rugby and have a curry.
Yes.